jump in, I just wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. So I'm currently in southern Maine, so we are all respectfully acknowledging that we are on the unceded land of the Wabanaki, and we are reliant on these resources every day, and use them in our environmental education every day as well. If you all are able, you're more than welcome to share where you're calling in from or what school you work at, or what grade you teach in the chat. And we're going to do a quick introduction here. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Maine Tree, which stands for the Maine Timber Resource and Environmental Education Foundation, educates and advocates for sustainable use of forests. And we do so through a bunch of different programs. We're an umbrella organization, so we have a number of programs that we run throughout the state. Half of them, or just about half of them, are environmental education based. So Project Learning Tree and our Forest Ecology Research Network are two of our big ones, as well as our Forest of Maine Teachers Tours. So our Project Learning Tree work and our Teachers Tours are both professional development events and projects that we're doing throughout the state all year. So I'll have some more on that at the end if you guys are looking for more professional development resources. But we also have our Forest Ecology Research Network, which helps classrooms and then local organizations get other groups of students and learners involved in forest research. So after we jump in today, we're going to start with hearing from Jay Wason from the UMaine School of Forest Resources. And then we're going to hear from one of our PLT facilitators and a high school teacher, Lindsay Strout. And they're both going to share with us how they incorporate forest biology and ecology with their students. And we'll also be able to break it out into other grade levels and other areas of implementation too at the end. So if you have any questions along the way, if you wouldn't mind putting them in the chat, I'll be helping Jay and Lindsay to see those as they come through, and then we'll have some time at the end as well to go over those and to brainstorm on implementation and things as well. So I'm going to pause my screen share here and switch it over to Jay.
1 second, everyone. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how I teach some aspects of forest biology here. I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a second, and hopefully to open up some discussion about some ways that you may be able to incorporate it into some of your education as well. Get the pointer. So just a little bit about me first. I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Forest Resources at UMaine Orono. I teach a range of biology and tree physiology courses. So I'm going to be focusing a bit more on the tree biology side of things. But I teach our intro biology course for freshman students coming in. And then I teach some higher level courses for some upper level undergraduate and graduate level courses. I also run a research lab here where I have graduate students, and so we do research on tree biology, tree ecology, and tree physiology, primarily focused around how trees respond to challenges from climate change. So just kind of a smattering of pictures from some of the experimental work we've done. We've worked in mountains in the region, for example. We use some tree rings for some studies. So to open up a conversation more broadly, if any of you have interest or want to chat in the future about some of the work that we do, I'd be happy to do that. So the way I'm going to run today is I'm basically going to show you and teach you like I teach some topics from some of my freshman courses. So some of the stuff is going to be maybe more advanced than you would use, but I was kind of told the idea here is I teach it at the level you'll understand, and then you can kind of distill it down to the groups you may be working with. So we're going to cover 3 topics today. The first one is going to be how trees grow. Then we're going to get into the concepts of photosynthesis, how light drives photosynthesis, and how we can understand shade tolerance of trees in particular. And then finally, we'll be talking a little bit about carbon, something we hear a lot about in the news today, and we'll contrast how we can think about carbon with animals and humans, to how it works in plants, and then we'll briefly talk about how that scales to entire ecosystems. So in my classes, I try to keep things active, and so I'll make you all the students today. So the first question today, our warm-up question, is how trees grow. So let's imagine we walk up to a tree and you hammer a nail a couple of inches into the tree, and this is what it looks like. If you come back to that tree 10 years later, you can just think to yourself for a second about which option you think would be the outcome. So option A, B, C, or D. So A and B show that the nail moves up, whereas C and D show that the nail does not move up. But B and D also show that the tree seems to engulf the nail a little bit, or it seems like the nail is being pulled into the tree. So hopefully you're all thinking about D down here as the key option. And this is a nice simple exercise, I think, and sums up a good understanding of primary and secondary growth. So this is kind of something that I do to review with my students after we've now talked about kind of more of the science behind it. So let's look at primary and secondary growth. This is how trees and all plants grow. Not all plants go through secondary growth, but all plants do primary growth. Primary growth is just the extension of a tree from its root or shoot tips. And so in this diagram here, it's just getting longer from the tips of the shoot or from the tips of the root. In contrast to that, secondary growth is the radial thickening of those roots and shoots after they've undergone primary growth. This is what we often think about when we think about wood and xylem formation and trees. And so secondary growth is key for understanding trees. If we cut down a tree, many of you are familiar with this concept of seeing growth rings in the tree. Those are formed by secondary growth. Here you're looking at a cross-section of a tree that's 3 years old, and you can get into an understanding of secondary growth by understanding how this key structure here, the cambium, or sometimes referred to as the vascular cambium, functions. This is the structure that makes wood, and it also makes the phloem. Many of you are familiar with kind of thinking about xylem and phloem and how those work in plants. This is the layer of cells that produces both xylem and phloem. It's confusing, and this is a really hard topic, I find, for students to get, how this is a dynamic structure and how it functions to create woody plants. But one way we can start to increase understanding there is asking students about how old are different growth rings within a plant. So here we're looking at 3 growth rings in the wood. The outermost growth ring of xylem is the newest xylem, the newest growth ring of wood. And so that was the one that was formed this year. And as you move further and further back in the plant, you find the older and older growth rings. The earliest cells here are the ones that were actually formed during primary growth of the plant, when it was very, very small and very narrow. I also ask students within a growth ring which cells are the youngest and which cells are the oldest as well. And so getting them to label those locations, they then start to realize that the youngest xylem cell is the one that's right next to the location where those cells are formed, which is this strip of cells here, the vascular cambium. So that's always a tough topic. And then you can take it on the flip side and also move into the phloem, which are these cells that are produced on the outside that transport sugars within plants. Now, the oldest phloem cells are the furthest from the vascular cambium. They would be out here, whereas the youngest phloem cells would be right near the cambium. Always a tough concept. However, depending on what level of detail you'd want to get into with that, we can begin to understand primary and secondary growth just by thinking about the way that we experience trees in the world. And so if any of you have a tree swing in your backyard, you can intuitively understand that primary growth, trees getting taller, occurs from the tips of the shoots because you don't have to go out every few years and lengthen the ropes on your tree swing, right? If the tree was getting taller from the base of the tree, it would actually be lifting your tree swing higher and higher up every year. And so because that's not the case, your tree swing stays at the same height. And so it's just getting longer at the tips of the branches. We can also think about secondary growth by looking at, this is an example here of a bullet that actually hit a tree. This is the bullet embedded in the trunk of a tree. And we can actually look out and see that this is where the growth ring that was at the most recently formed one when the tree was hit by the bullet. But then after that, it formed, was able to heal over that damage And now we've got many, many more years that have been produced of xylem outside of that growth ring. So now this bullet's kind of embedded or hidden inside of that tree. And then also, especially if you've had young children and are familiar with pushing a stroller down a sidewalk, we're familiar with how trees lift up sidewalks, and they do this with secondary growth as well. So it was a very, very small root that went under that sidewalk, but over the years it continues to get larger and larger by secondary growth, and it has enough force behind it to actually lift sidewalk concrete. That was a brief intro into primary and secondary growth. Now I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about carbon. We're going to talk about carbon in animals, carbon in plants, and carbon in ecosystems. One good question I find to get students thinking about this is, where does the dry matter in a tree come from? And one way I bring that home is I often bring a piece of wood and I say, where does, like a piece of firewood, where does this come from? Where does this firewood, the material in here, come from? And I let students think about that for a while or work in groups. And if I want to give them a hint, then I kind of give them a misleading hint by saying, well, what do you give your houseplants? Because you have to take care of your houseplants, and they also grow into these larger organisms. And people start to think, well, I fertilize them a little bit maybe, and I give them some water. And so if you haven't been introduced to this topic before, you may think that most of the mass of a plant comes from fertilizer and maybe comes from water. But what's so amazing about plants is that actually most of the biomass, we call it, or the dry matter of a plant, comes from the air. So this is a table here showing all these different elements that are in plants. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at the percent of mass in the dry tissue that element makes up. And right away, you can see that carbon and oxygen make up combined 90% of the mass of a plant. And that carbon and oxygen primarily comes from carbon dioxide. So that's coming from the air, those carbon dioxide molecules in the air. None of that is something that you gave your plant, unless you think about how you were maybe exhaling carbon dioxide around your plants when you were taking care of them. We also think about water, and yes, you do give your plants water, and that water does get incorporated into the plant's body a little bit, but it only makes up maybe 6% of the mass of a plant. So it's a relatively small percentage. And then the stuff most people think about is fertilizer. That combined makes up about 2 or 3% of the mass of a plant. It's a very, very small percentage. So here you're looking at nitrogen, which is the most important one often in our ecosystems and in our gardens. And that only makes up 1.5% of the mass of the plant. This is usually where I pause and say, isn't that so cool? I mean, isn't that amazing that like all of our forests, like when you're walking through the woods, it's almost completely made of air, if you want to phrase it that way, or from carbon dioxide initially. It's pretty amazing. So now let's think a little bit about animals, and for that we'll use humans as our example. But we can ask ourselves, well, where does my mass come from, or where does your mass come from? And we all know intuitively that it comes from eating food. So we consume food and we break it down to release the energy inside of that food and to build new molecules in our bodies. This energy especially allows me and the cells in my body to do work. Work is intuitive for us as humans. We think about moving around, for example, that's work. My overly gesturing hands, for example, is doing work. We can also ask ourselves, well, why do we breathe? And we also kind of know this intuitively. We breathe because we know we need oxygen. Oxygen is important for us. If you go swimming and hold your breath underwater, you definitely need oxygen. So we think about what goes in when we breathe, and the key molecules there are oxygen molecules. And then we exhale, and the important thing that comes out is carbon dioxide. I already hinted about that a little bit before. So oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide comes out. This is where I introduce our first chemical equation for the day. This is the first of 2 chemical equations you're going to learn, and this is the equation for respiration. So what we're talking about there is we're respiring, we're breaking down those molecules to release the energy in them. So in this case, we're just using sugar as the example, but it could be any other type of molecule that maybe you've consumed as food. You do need oxygen for this reaction to occur, and then it's going to release carbon dioxide, water, and then the key thing that our bodies are looking for is energy. And so we're able to use that energy. So that's respiration. That's humans, but that's also animals. That's also fungi in the soil. Now let's compare and contrast that to plants. Plants are much more like us than we often think initially, not in terms of how they behave or what they look like, but in terms of the chemical reactions that are happening in their bodies. Plants also go through this respiration process. They have to break down food to release energy in order to do work. Now, work for a plant just looks differently than work for a human does. For us, we often think about movement, like I said, but for plants, they need to do work by growing, keeping cells alive, repairing things, moving things within their bodies. That all takes energy. And so to do that, the plant needs a source of food that it can break down to release energy by respiration. This releases carbon dioxide when they go through respiration, just like us. So this is where it starts to get confusing because everybody thinks, well, the plants are supposed to be bringing in carbon dioxide. Now you're telling me they're releasing it. Well, the key here is where do they get their food? So instead of eating food, they magically make their own with the process of photosynthesis, which is the second chemical equation you'll learn from me today. It's quite a simple one because we just take the process of respiration and flip it backwards. So now the inputs to photosynthesis are carbon dioxide from the air, water that they're getting from the root system, light energy from the sun, and then they turn that into sugars and oxygen. So this is why plants are releasing oxygen when they're conducting photosynthesis, but they're also producing sugars. This is that magical step where they take the air and they turn it into a sugar molecule. And then the sugar molecule is just the starting point for now they can turn that into a cellulose molecule, or they can respire that and burn that for energy, for example, or anything else that they need. The key for plants, and what we're going to explore a little bit more, is that in the sunlight, plants uptake more carbon dioxide for photosynthesis than they release from respiration. So that's worth pausing on for a second. When it's sunny and they're conducting photosynthesis, they're uptaking more carbon dioxide into their body than they're releasing from respiration. Remember, they're doing work in burning sugars and releasing carbon dioxide, but they're doing a lot more photosynthesis than that. So this is a concept that I've kind of, in a lot of my classes, I've decided to focus in on and see if I can really get students to tease this apart, because it's tough, especially the first time you hear it. And so one way that I've been working on that, and I often use graphs in my classes, is by having an activity where students take a graph like this, where we have time of day on the x-axis, so just from midnight to midnight over a 24-hour period, and here's the middle of the day. And then the y-axis is carbon dioxide or CO2 exchange. And so if the organism is taking carbon dioxide into its body, it would be a positive value. And if it's releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, that would be a negative value. And what I ask the students to do in their groups is to draw a line on this graph for what they think a human or any other non-plant organism would look like in terms of its exchange of carbon dioxide over the course of a day, and the same for plants. And I put a little, some hints on here about what humans and what plants are doing. So this is where I'm actually going to pause. I'll try to do about a minute, and I'm going to have you, if you've got a notebook near you or something, see if you can actually sketch this out. Over the course of a day, what do you think the line would look like for uptake of carbon dioxide or release of carbon dioxide for humans and plants? So try to draw two lines on that, and I'll wait for about a minute. All right, so I'll show you what I've got here. I did the human line first. This is one thing that you could draw for a human. I'm not a human physiologist in any way, but there's some key things we can take from this line. Notice that this line is below zero the entire time. So humans are never uptaking carbon dioxide into their body. And that's where you'd be thinking about photosynthesis. We're not bringing carbon dioxide in by photosynthesis. We're always releasing it. We're always exhaling carbon dioxide. So the more negative this value, the more we're releasing. And so I had the line be a little bit closer to zero, maybe when we're sleeping, if you're getting your good 12 hours of sleep a night, like I'm sure we all are. And then I had that line dip further down during the day when we're being a little bit more active. Maybe you went for a run or you're doing other things. And so your body's working harder and it's releasing more carbon dioxide. So the further down we are, the more carbon dioxide we're releasing. So this is one example of what we might expect for a human. Notice that we're not focused on units here or anything like that, just the concept. The next line is for plants. So this is an example of what you might see for a plant. So here you can see that we're way on the other side of this graph. We've got some really, really high positive values. So let's look at that first. That's telling us during the middle of the day, the plants are doing a lot of CO2 uptake. That's photosynthesis. That's the idea, that concept that we're all really familiar with. The really tricky part where I often catch students though is down here. So at night, this value actually goes below 0 for plants. So notice if we envision that the sun goes down around, or comes up around 6 a.m. and goes down around 6 p.m., the plant isn't conducting any photosynthesis, but it's still doing respiration. Remember, the plant is alive, so it's still burning sugars to keep itself alive, and that causes it to release carbon dioxide. And then the last challenging point that I don't have on here as an example, or as a line, is the plant is actually respiring all the time. It just so happens that during the day, it does more photosynthesis than its respiration. So it's still releasing carbon dioxide all the time, but it's actually just quickly taking that back up by photosynthesis during the day. So that's about where I try to get my intro students kind of thinking about how plants work and how that relates to how animals work in terms of photosynthesis and respiration. Then the amazing thing about this, especially with the photosynthesis side of things, is you can take this and you can scale this by huge numbers, because this is a really important process on Earth globally. About half of the photosynthesis on Earth is happening on land. And to see that effect and how important photosynthesis is, we can look at this kind of famous curve called the Keeling curve. And so the x-axis here is the year from late 1950s all the way up to, this was in 2020, but the pattern is continuing, I can assure you. And the y-axis is the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere. So this is measuring the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in the air around us. And so I usually ask students two things. Tell me, what are the two key patterns that you see here? One is they say that there's a large long-term increase. The other is that there's kind of these ups and downs. And these are monthly values, these measurements here. So the long-term increase, we can get into the burning of fossil fuels and climate change discussions. I'm not going to go there with the lesson today. But I wanted to link this to photosynthesis, and that's where these ups and downs occur. And so in this little animation here, the green area is depicting the vegetative area on Earth, vegetated area on Earth. And it's also depicting the seasons. And so notice this blanket of snow cover that's occurring. This would be in the winter season. So a huge reduction in the amount of green area that we have on Earth. Much less photosynthesis occurring in the winter time for the northern hemisphere. Much less of an impact in the southern hemisphere. And so when this top area here, this boreal forest in particular, is dormant, is not functioning, there's not as much photosynthesis happening on Earth. And that's actually what's driving these ups and downs. And so I often run a little activity too, where I have students think about, well, are the annual dips, the low points, are those representing the summer or the winter for the northern hemisphere? So around us, for example, in Maine, is the dip in carbon dioxide concentration each year driven by the summer or the winter? I'll have you think about it for a second, because it's kind of a tough one at first. So one thing I like to think about here is there's been some analogies which are imperfect, especially if you just taught people about photosynthesis and respiration. But the boreal forests, people sometimes use this analogy for the rainforest, but I would argue too that the boreal forest is the lungs of the planet in some ways. There's a lot of photosynthesis happening there. And when the boreal forest is active, it's going to go and bring in a lot of carbon dioxide. So if it's bringing it into its body by photosynthesis of all those plants, that's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So those dips are actually representing the summertime. So the dips, the annual dips here represent the summer for the northern hemisphere, because there's so much photosynthetic activity that it's pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then the winter time is represented by an increase just because they've gone dormant at that stage, and it kind of increases back to its baseline. Okay, so that's where I wanted to focus on carbon. And now I'm going to transition into the last piece here, which is photosynthesis, light, and shade tolerance for plants. And this is a really fun one because it gets you thinking about these little things in the understory. These are northern white cedar seedlings competing with balsam fir seedlings, and how they actually can grow in the forest understory. So I'm going to skip, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over kind of some of the anatomy that we see in a leaf here, but an activity I do run with students, if you do get into some of the leaf anatomy, is to talk about where photosynthesis occurs and then how we get all the stuff for photosynthesis to the plant or to that cell, and then how we get it out of that cell, the products of photosynthesis. And so you could show the equation. I don't have the equation here for photosynthesis, but you could remind students that these kind of greenish cells in the middle here, these are the ones that are conducting photosynthesis. So we have to get stuff to them and stuff away from them. And so I often have students do drawing on these types of diagrams. Here we can show how light gets to these cells, for example. It just comes right through the upper layer of cells called the epidermis. We'll kind of use this cell as our example cell right now, but I kind of shift around a little bit. We have to get water to that cell, and now that causes us to have an understanding of this vein. This is a vein that has both xylem for water transport and phloem for sugar transport. And so some water will come up that vein and it can work its way over to that cell. I kind of shifted to the other side. You can envision one of these other cells is also doing photosynthesis. We have to get carbon dioxide to these cells, and that's going to come in through these openings in the bottom of the leaf called stomata. So these are pores in the bottom of the leaf called stomata, and that allows carbon dioxide gas to diffuse into the leaf. We also know that oxygen needs to leave. Oxygen is a byproduct, and that's one of the things that we really benefit from this photosynthetic process that goes out the same way. And then we produce sugars or glucose molecules by this process of photosynthesis, and maybe we need to send those nearby to an apple or something. Hopefully you've all gone apple picking recently. The sugars in that apple were produced in a leaf, and they had to be sent through this set of structures called the phloem over to that apple. So we also have to move the sugars there. So that's a lot of stuff that needs to get moved around. One of the things I really focus on in my teaching is this concept of where the stomata are and why. So the stomata are these openings on the bottoms of leaves, and I want you to think to yourself for a second, why are the stomata usually on the bottom of the leaf? They're almost never on the top. In some cases there are, right? It's biology, but why are they almost always on the bottom of the leaf? I'll just pause for a few seconds. I find that this is kind of an integrating topic because it forces you to think about all the things that a leaf needs to do. And one of the main reasons why the stomata are on the bottom of the leaf is because of this. More than 95% of the water that goes into a plant that enters a tree, for example, just evaporates into the atmosphere out of the leaves. That's the process of transpiration. So that's this big blue arrow I just added here. So while this whole process of photosynthesis is occurring, 95% or more of the water that goes in the roots of the tree just leaves the leaves through the stomata. Why do plants waste all this water then? It seems like such a waste, right? Especially a year like this where we had a drought in Maine, for example. It seems like a waste of water. The reason, so this is kind of the reason, kind of links to the reasoning of why the stomata are on the bottom. The reason is because we have to get this red line in, right? We have to get carbon dioxide into the leaf. If we don't open these pores in the bottom of the leaf, then we can't get the carbon dioxide in. But in the process of opening those pores, you've now exposed the wet internal surface of the leaf, and water will just evaporate out. The analogy I sometimes give is walk around with your mouth open on a hot, dry day in the desert, your mouth is going to dry out. That's kind of what's happening to the insides of the leaf. And so it has this trade-off where it's trying to get carbon dioxide in, and it's losing a ton of water by evaporation, or transpiration is what we call it, in the same process. So that's where most of the water goes. Now, if that's a big problem for a plant and it wants to conserve water, if you have all your openings on the top up here, now you've got a bunch of sunlight getting into the leaf. It's heating it up and drying it out even more on the inside. So here you just naturally shade all those openings. It keeps it cooler and moister. And so that helps to limit how much water is lost from a leaf, especially during dry conditions. The other reason is we want this top region to be focused on photosynthesis. If we put a whole bunch of holes up here, now we're going to have all this airspace and we're going to be blocking all this light and not able to harvest light. So plants have really specialized the tops of their leaves for light harvesting and the bottom of their leaves for gas exchange. So that concept, I find, why the stomata on the bottom helps us now understand why we have spongy mesophyll and palisade mesophyll, for example, and some of these other things. I recognize I'm not going through all those concepts now, but I wanted to plug this one concept of why the stomata tend to be on the bottom of the leaf. That leads us into our last topic. How can some plants grow in the shade? So we always teach how important light is for plants, but especially in places like Maine, we have a lot of very shade tolerant species, plants that can grow in the forest understory where there's very little light. Now, some light does get in there, and there's these concept of sun flex and other things like that, but this is where I bring in the concept of different leaf anatomies, which we're not going to get into much here, but we have sun leaves and shade leaves of the same species here. So this is a leaf from the same species grown in the sunshine versus one that's grown in the shade of that canopy, for example. So you can start to envision here, we're looking at the vein. The one grown in the sun is probably using a lot more water. It has all these cells for transporting water, whereas the one in the shade maybe isn't using as much. Also, it's a thicker leaf, so it's probably able to conduct a lot more photosynthesis than the one in the shade is. And so they're built much differently. And so using sun versus shade leaves is a nice way to kind of teach how some of the anatomy of a leaf relates to its environment. So I try to bring this concept home to some species that we're familiar with in Maine and the Northeast. Paper birch, a shade intolerant species, and eastern hemlock, a very shade tolerant species. So paper birch can't grow in the shade. It needs a lot of sunlight in order to function, whereas hemlock can grow in very shady conditions. And this brings in what I use as a relatively complex topic, this concept of light response curves. And so you can introduce this in a number of ways, but in the end, it's just a graph showing the x-axis is light intensity from 0 all the way up to very, very high light conditions. So at 0 is darkness. And the y-axis is familiar to you now. You have CO2 uptake on the y-axis. So a positive value means photosynthesis is occurring. A negative value means no photosynthesis. It's only respiration occurring. And we can draw lines on here for a shade-grown species or a sun-grown, or shade-grown leaf or a sun-grown leaf. And we can compare those, or they relate to shade-tolerant and intolerant species. So let's look at the shade tolerant species. It does not respire as much as the shade intolerant species. That 0 mark is not as low. So that's when there's no sunlight available. It's not burning as much sugar. It's a cheaper leaf, we can think of it, to maintain. Therefore, it doesn't need nearly as much light to break even. This is when respiration is balanced out with photosynthesis. But eventually it kind of gets saturated. It can't handle much more light. It can't really keep going faster and faster and faster. It's not adapted to those conditions. In contrast, a sun-grown leaf is a very expensive leaf to maintain. It has a high respiration rate, meaning very low negative value. Therefore, it's going to need more light in order to offset that respiration rate. And that's part of the reason why we have shade-grown species, because here you can see that the shade leaf or the shade-tolerant species, that line is higher than for the sun leaf or the shade-intolerant species. So the difference between these two lines. It's not out until about 300, this value of 300 micromoles, where the sun-grown leaf starts to win out in terms of photosynthesis. And you can see it can continue up and can go really, really fast. It's able to really take advantage of those high light conditions. When I'm teaching this concept, I sometimes use a fancy sports car compared to kind of, in this case, a 1998 Honda Civic is the example. On a BMW, for example, it can go really fast, right? So we can achieve really high rates of photosynthesis. We can go really fast, but it has really high maintenance costs. And so that's that low that extreme respiration rate. So if you ever had to change the brakes on a BMW, you know, it's very expensive, or even the windshield wipers, I assume, are very expensive on a BMW. I wouldn't know. But on a 1998 Honda Civic, which you still see quite a few of them bouncing around on the roads today, they can't go very fast, maybe. So their fast photosynthesis rate may not be too much, but they're pretty cheap to maintain. So their respiration rate is not nearly as extreme as it is for the sports car. And I'll finish here just with a testing of our understanding of those concepts. So looking at two species you may be familiar with: American beech, a shade-tolerant species, versus quaking aspen, a shade-intolerant species. Which tree would you expect to have these three conditions? A higher maximum photosynthesis rate, a more expensive leaf, using that concept of a lot more respiration, and a higher respiration rate. And so hopefully you were thinking about the quaking aspen leaves. Those are expensive leaves, but that's okay because they often have a lot of light, so can conduct a lot of photosynthesis. It introduces an interesting discussion that we won't get into now for the sake of time, but how can shade-tolerant trees like American beech and eastern hemlock be competitive in the forest then? It's because in the forest understory, we have low light conditions. And so they're down here in this realm of low light conditions where our shade tolerant line can be just as good or better than this shade intolerant species, which can't really do well in low light conditions. And that's where I'm going to end it. So I'll just say thank you for your time. Here's my contact info. And I think these slides are going to be posted if you want access to that, but I'd be happy to chat about any more of these concepts or how to incorporate them into any of your education activities. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Does anyone have questions for Jay while we're here? We'll have more time for questions at the end. I just want to make sure that we have time while all of that's fresh in our brains. Okay. If we don't have questions, then we can switch things over to Lindsay. Lindsay is a high school teacher at Sanford High School. She's also a PLT facilitator. So she helps us teach project learning tree to other educators. And she's going to talk to us about how she incorporates some of these topics with her students.
Thank you for the introduction. And Jay, I just want to say, holy cow, I was taking notes like madman. I was like, oh, I want to do this next semester with my students. So I've more or less ended my tree unit with my high school students. But I'm so excited to pick your brain and use some of your slides from what you just gave us. So I hope everybody else was mad dash typing and writing down notes. And I actually just went back in and edited my document that I'm about to share with you guys because I was like, oh, I want to share that too. So, Lena, I should be good to share. Am I correct?
I think so. If you're not, Logan will have to help us real quick.
No, I should be all set.
Okay.
I'm gonna do. Oh, it's been a hot minute, you guys. So bear with me. Do this, and hopefully I'm gonna do that. And I can still see you guys. So can I get a quick thumbs up? You guys can see that? Sweet. Thank you. Awesome. So yeah, I'm Lindsay Strout. I work at Sanford High School. I'm a high school biology teacher and wildlife bio teacher. I was handed the wildlife biology course a couple of years ago and with like a week's notice. So I was like, what am I teaching? When? What? And I've just fallen in love completely with it. So this is actually a screenshot of the one on the left-hand side is my nature journal, which I'll talk to you a little bit about a little bit later in the presentation. But Zabrinia is a plant. I was actually just running up in Portland where I live, and there's a elementary school, the Portland high school. There's a high school with Zabrinia growing outside. And I was like, whoa, it grows outside. I thought it was a house plant indoors only. But this is one that I usually go out and buy this house plant from like Home Depot and then bring it in. And I show my students, both wildlife and general biology students, under a microscope. The top right view is literally, there's no dye needed, no nothing. You just put the leaf upside down under the microscope. You don't even need a slide. You don't need anything prepped. And this is literally what you see. And then all my students, we are a no cell phone policy school, but they're like, can I take my phone out and take a picture of this? They get super giddy looking at it through the microscope. The stomata, what Jay was talking about, where the gas goes in and out of the cell, they are popping out at you in that green, vibrant. So I nature journaled about it, and I could have gone way more into detail, but just noting that it's incredible how many number of these stomata cells are on the bottom of these Zabrinia leaves. So if you have a microscope, I have a very cheap one at home, even because I'm a nerdy science dude. So I have one, and I would suggest getting one because even if you're in elementary school, they can be kind of expensive-ish, but having one to show your students is awesome. So thank you, Jay, for that. It inspired me to show you guys this. So what I do, I start my students off with tree ID, especially if I have 2 semesters in my school year. So I usually wait until later in the spring semester to do a tree ID because I'm not really awesome with naked trees or trees without leaves. And so we go out early fall and we use the Forest Trees of Maine book using the dichotomous key. And I usually give them some sort of helpful tips on, we go over, different shapes of leaves, different, is it serrated, is it lobed, is it compound, is it simple? And then is it deciduous, is it coniferous, and what does that mean? And my fun little learning tools, coniferous usually have cones, and not all cones are pine cones. And then the other one is deciduous, and when I write the D of the deciduous, a capital D, I make it into a leaf. So that's usually a fun little learning tool that I do with my students. So after we do kind of the notes indoors, I take my students right outside. If you see this glowing thing behind me, that's literally a maple completely engorged in its fall foliage right now. But I also bring my wildlife biology students out. We collect leaves and then we crush the cells and do a chromatography lab, and we look at the different pigments inside the leaves as they're changing color. So I usually have them go out and find a green leaf and find some sort of colored leaf and look at the pigments that come through with that lab. But we spend a lot of days outside with the Forest Trees of Maine book. Just getting them used to it. I usually have them take pictures of a tree nearby their house and multiple pictures. So I have them, my email gets inundated with, here's a picture of the tree at my mailbox. Here's a picture of the tree at my bus stop. But anyways, the leaf or needle, the bark and the branch. Is it opposite? Is it alternate? Where are the buds on the tree? What do the buds look like? And then we ID their trees as a class together. And then they go home and say like, hey, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, we have a blah, blah, blah tree at the end of our driveway. And we've even done it here on campus. And we test our principal and assistant principals what the trees are outside our or at the entrance of our school. So that's been fun to do. And if I forgot to say, Lena, if there's any questions, if anybody has any questions, if you put them in the chat box at any time, I am definitely like, interrupt me as I go. So what I then do is have my students pick a tree and research it. I say around the world, I do have a few that want to find the craziest, weirdest tree out there and research it. And then I usually have a few that kind of stick around Maine. It's funny, I just went hiking and I saw so many big tooth aspen leaves on the ground up north. Unreal. And like, I don't see them that often down here. I have quaking aspen on campus, but not so much the big tooth. So I was like, oh, I know that because Lindsay R, my student, she researched it. And so they teach each other about the trees that they're interested in. And I've got a whole criteria that they do. And then I make them present it. The wildlife biology course that I teach is a junior senior class elective. And I asked them, like, when was the last time you had to present? And some of them, it's been since 8th grade. Now, granted, the pandemic might have thrown that off a little bit, but I was surprised at, wow, you guys haven't presented in a very long time. So, they're up there, they're nervous, they're shaking, just like I have my notes and I'm not even looking at them, but they're there, I know they're there. And it gives them good skills to practice. So we go through this after we have gone outside for multiple days, and then they present. This was taken just yesterday. I actually went up to Flagstaff Lake, Bigelow Preserve along the AT. I froze my tush off. It was supposed to be around 32 degrees the night. It was in the single digits, real feel. We had every possible layer on, but when we got up in the morning, you can actually see there's frost and actually a little bit of like frozen rain / snow. We weren't sure what it was actually doing out. We were in the tent. It was like, I'm not listening to this. This is not snow. This is insane. But me and my partner, we went out and we hiked the Bigelow Preserve. And when you're on top, such as this view, and looking down at Flagstaff Lake and literally seeing the different trees. So literally seeing the coniferous forest, the deciduous forest, you can literally see the lines of those trees and the color variation. It's unreal. And walking in, if anybody's done this hike or wants to do it, let me know. Do it like a month ago because when it'll be warmer. But literally you're walking, hiking in, and you're just in this beautiful maple and birch, and everything's this orangey yellow, and then all of a sudden you hit this wall and you're boom into coniferous green trees, and it's insane the difference. And obviously at the top of the peak was just coniferous as well, but unreal the foliage this past weekend and right now too. Jay, this is a question maybe for you. I found this on my hike. So being a nature journaler and teaching wildlife biology, I have this like this new set of glasses on that I see things and I can never hike the same. I can't walk the same because I'm always looking at things differently. And I'm like, oh, what's this? Oh, what's this? So I'm hiking and I come across this thing. And I think it's a balsam fir. Am I correct in that sense? Yes, like I see a head nod. And I see this, it's in the palm of my hand. It was about 1 centimeter long. And this, I did bust it open. I didn't have my microscope. I would have brought it home with me. It's a worm of some sort, a little red worm. Can you identify this for me? Is it invasive? Should I be worried? Should I tell people about this?
I'm not sure. I'll ask around here. I always get asked these kinds of things. I don't study the bugs, but
Okay.
yeah, I'll look into it. I'll let you know.
Okay. I did a very, very quick search last night when I got home with Wi-Fi, and it came up with balsam gall midge. I never heard of it. Maybe Logan and Lena. I don't know. Nothing. Okay. Anyways, I will get emails like this as well, Jay, from, oh, you're the wildlife biology teacher. You know this. And I'm like, no, I don't. Right. I have literally been handed this is ridiculous. A couple of years ago, I was literally handed in a Tupperware container a mouse that had been transported via student to student to student to student and made it into the lunchroom. And the assistant principal said, you know, a wildlife rehabber, can you take this? And I was like, I'm teaching right now. So anyways, the fun joys of teaching. You get handed random stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about nature journaling, what it is, and Project Learning Trees. They've got a worksheet. I couldn't tell you the page number, but in the book, it's Adopt a Tree lesson. And what I have my students do is I kind of take this and the prompts that are in Project Learning Trees lesson, and I blend it with my nature journaling. And so I have my students go outside. I'm very lucky in the sense that on campus, I go out a couple flights of stairs, go outside, and I literally have trees. And I have my students, I cut up little yoga mats so they have little dry spots to put their butts down, because I leave them. I say, go be in nature, go find a tree and adopt a tree and get to know it. And so they sit there. I leave them for, honestly, this might be depending on your age level of students that you're teaching. I left my students for 15 minutes. And when I was calling them in, they were like, wait, hold on 1 more minute. So I could have left them maybe for 20 minutes or even longer. But I'll show you some of their pages that they have created. This was kind of fun. I get a lot of, I can't draw, or I stink at this. I'm not good. And I mean, these are high school students. And for some reason along the way, somebody has told them it's not perfect, it's not great for some reason. And I try and build that back up with them and invoke curiosity. So this is all my students kind of, I did a 1, 2, 3, expose your nature journal. And they were like, no, mine is horrible. And they're like, oh, we all kind of stink together. We're all not good at this. And I even put mine in because I want to show them that we could all be nature journaling the exact same tree, and we could get different things out of it. Kind of a neat thing. So these are some of, and so this one specifically, they will go back out multiple times in the year to look at this same tree, what's happening to it, what's different about it, and look back in their nature journal as well. So this one was purely like, just ask your tree questions. So some of my students, I'll let you guys read for a second, but these are some of their pages. And a really fun thing to do is do leaf rubbings. So these are juniors, seniors in high school. And I was like, yeah, take a leaf. I like, you know, they're going to lose them anyways. Yeah, let's not take a whole branch off. Or can you find a leaf that you think belongs to that tree? I'm not all about like picking things if we can find them elsewhere and harvesting off a tree. But my students went haywire over leaf rubbings. Like, I haven't done this since I was in kindergarten. And I'm like, I still do it and I'm 30. So doing this was able to capture a moment of their childhood, bring that back, as well as relating to that tree. It might have brought them back to, I used to go out with my mom to graveyards and I'd have to rub the graveyards and I hated doing that, but give me a tree leaf and I was totally happy. So tree rubbings, any age is fun. So here's some more nature journals as well. I love this one over to the left. Are those your branches on the ground? Like sad face. I don't know what happened to that tree. And I think that, oh, this one, here we go. I think some of the more interesting conversations when we came back all together, and I asked them to share one question from each. And I don't know if we've gone to it just yet, but you know, why are you where you are, or how far did your seed travel from? Because we talk about seed dispersal during this unit as well, and kind of like, where did you come from? How far did you have to travel? How old are you? Because we know that when you cut a tree down, you can count the rings, like Jay was talking. And I actually have a cool thing. I'm gonna stop my share for half a second. Hopefully I'm a big screen for you, or pin. Oh, thank you. So I actually have, this was donated to my classroom. It is a massive, I pretend it's my my bathroom pass. Like if any student needs to go to the bathroom, like, yeah, it's the beaver log. So this was donated to me by a friend up in Jackman, Maine. And it's kind of a neat thing because the outer bark has totally been eaten. And the rings are really, really cool. And I don't know how amazingly detailed you guys can all see that, but I asked them, look at this ring compared to this ring way out here. This one's almost 4 times the size. So we talk about what trees go through. And so using this as a talking piece, not a bathroom pass, but a talking piece of what happened to this tree. Can you tell this tree's story? Like, what did this feel like? And why can't I break it? Right? This should be, a lot of my students are like, I can break that. And they go to refund and they're like, oh my gosh, I actually can't, that's really solid. And so talking about the strength of a tree and things like that. So I always like to have that it's literally at the entrance of my door. So when you come in, students are like, what the heck is that? And so I say, take wildlife biology to my bio students. And then in wildlife, we get to talk about it. So I'm going to go back to presenting. All right. So yeah, it's super fun to go out with my students and nature journal with them. So I use the PLT here and there with that, but I also use my own prompts. So the next thing I want to transition to is PLT's invasive species. So I was given given wildlife biology, 2 weeks to plan, and a whole bunch of stuff came with it. And I said I was going to not do this too much, but I'm going to stop sharing again. Lena or Logan, if you could spotlight me one more time. Thank you. I was given a box of stuff and I was like, okay, so this one comes from the Maine Forest Service entomology lab. And I was like, okay, what is this? Right. I'm a little bit nervous. There's also some really cool old stamps on it. So I'm opening it up and literally all it is just like packets of tissues, like I was like, what is this? I don't understand this. What's happening? And so I do this whole thing, right? This whole thing is full of it. And this tiny, tiny little vial. And in it is the emerald ash borer. And so when I tell my students that this is killing all of our ash trees, and I compare it to my finger and how tiny it is, and I'm sorry, the glare is not the perfect. Anyways, it's tiny. When you have grown up in Maine your entire life and not actually seen one in person, and you've only ever seen a picture, and this is the bottom right hand corner, the picture to the right, I didn't know how big it was. I was genuinely shocked when I saw, holy crap, that's the little invasive thing. Who found this, right? I have all these questions. So anyways, I talk about invasive species and I always bring this out And I hold it all tight and I'm like, how big do you guys think it is? And they think it's like the size of your finger. They think it's like this huge, gross bug. And I pull this out and I show it to them. And they're genuinely surprised of, oh my gosh, that's what's hurting our trees. That's what's killing our ash trees. So along with this, they can pick, I think what I did last year, they picked multiple species, where it's native to, where it's found now. How did it get there? Like, oops, accidental, we don't know yet. And then are there any things that we as humans can do to help fix it? So I do go through this with my students. I haven't done it this year, but last year my students, I think I did it around the world as well. And some students chose local ones, some students chose ones around the world, similar to the tree as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is the Green Jobs Personality Quiz. So my students, I think, being in Southern Maine, and maybe you could say this for all of Maine, is what jobs are out there? What can I do with my life? Or I have a lot of seniors that come take this class because I need an extra science credit and they really don't know what they want to do. So we take the Green Jobs in the Project Learning Tree book. We take the quiz and they really don't know. They're like, what are we doing with this? I don't get this. And then I present them like their results and what personality they get and kind of what jobs align with that. And so these are my students and what they've come up with of what their personality type right now and what could match up with the job in the forest industry. So it's a lot of fun. A lot of them are like, I could be a what? I don't even know what this is. And so just showing them what job options there are in Maine. I know that I grew up in the Oxford Hills and I was like, I'm going to leave and I'm never looking back. Right. And then here I am back in Maine. So I want to show them that you can stay in Maine, you can work here, you can do a job that you wouldn't even have known about. So expressing that to them, showing them the wildland firefighter cracks me up. She was like genuinely like, oh my gosh, I could legit do that. That's the coolest thing ever. I had a student last year I want to kind of spotlight. She is an amazing student, came in, she was in my fall semester, took wildlife biology. I think she was just genuinely interested, but didn't need it as a graduation requirement, which is about a 50-50 mix for the class. So I might have groggy students are like, oh, I have to take this. But by the end or midway through, I got them hooked. But anyways, she had her senior meeting with her guidance counselor. And she literally told him, like, I don't know what I want to do. I'm clueless. I don't know what I want to do. Nothing has been like, I want to be at this when I grow up. Ever since I was in second grade. So we did this quiz and one of her jobs that popped up was a wildlife biologist. And she didn't really tell me, it kind of like snuck up and she's like, hey, so I just got accepted to Montana State and the University of Montana for wildlife biology. And I just like dropped and I was like, are you kidding me? That's unreal. So beyond proud of her for getting that. And so anyways, the long of the short is that showing our students, I don't care how old, what grade you teach, showing them it's not a teacher, a vet, a firefighter, a police officer, a food worker, showing them that there's more out there. I love this quiz because it does give them a huge, like, graphic artist. People are like, how do you do that with trees? And I have literally the poster that they're all standing in front of. It's the forest trees of Maine. And somebody had created that. And so showing them that art and science go together as well. So hopefully some ideas for your classroom. I'm sure I flew through that way quicker than I expected. But if you need to contact me, Lindsay Strout, lstrout@samford.org. I'm happy to answer questions or share any materials with you that I've created or that I've tweaked or anything like that. But thank you so much. I do see some chat, but I haven't opened them just yet. But I'll go ahead, do this so I can see everybody again.
It looks like Logan agreed with you on the balsam gall midge. That was one of the things.
Thanks, Logan.
And then it looks like Logan got to another question as well. But we can reach out to the entomology lab and see if they have, if not specimens like Lindsay has, educational materials on different invasives, especially the insect kind. I'm pretty sure I've seen even print materials that have like size comparisons and all of those types of things too. So they might have something like that that could be helpful as well. All right, I'm gonna now share my screen again. So we have talked about quite a few different things today in terms of topics and different ways to talk with students about the different topics. So if you don't already have a PLT K through 8 guide, I will be getting an access code for that out to you in the next few days. So you should see that this week. But I wanted to go through a couple of different options here that either were mentioned or relate here as well, especially with different grade levels. So Lindsay mentioned this one. Adopt a Tree is actually in the K through 8 guide as a K through 2 activity. I've done it with middle school and high school too, though, and I love that opportunity to let the focus just become on one object, and also give them the opportunity to collect data on that as well. And so Adopt a Tree is a really fun one. I've seen elementary schools almost make like a forest plot themselves, and then everybody gets a different tree and you have to take notes on that tree and those types of things. But there are a bunch of different options there for verbal and nonverbal students. And then 3 through 5, these activities are some of my favorites and goes a lot along with a lot of what Jay was talking about. So Every Tree for Itself covers what trees need to thrive and to survive. So it goes through all the different requirements and how those are met. And there are also a lot of really cool tie-ins here to human health to make that comparison and to kind of go further into detail as well in terms of the chemistry and the biology of that, if that's something that your students are ready for. And then Tree Factory is another really fun one, and looks at the different parts of a tree. Jake kind of got into the beginnings of that, but it really looks at the different structures and functions of tree biology and is able to bring that down to a 3 through 5 level. And there are variations in there too for K to 2. So it looks at, like, in the easier or in the earlier years, looks at why leaves might be necessary and what they compare to on a human body, and those types of comparisons that make things a little bit more tangible. And then there are so many that you can dive into in further detail, especially with the middle school and high school students. Field, forest, and stream is one of my favorites because it starts to look at abiotic and biotic, which is where you can tie in that light tolerance factor and kind of look at the ecosystem as a whole, and also like the moisture. You can look at, I'm working with one school that's looking at a wetland compared to a swamp compared to a forest with their elementary students. And so that kind of gives the platform to start that exploration and to give basis to kind of come back to on that. And then of course, tree cookies are also really fun. And we have some if you can't get your hands on them, but looking at the different tree rings and kind of starting to talk about not only how the tree grows, but what it might mean when tree rings are different. We touched on that a little bit, but you of course can also tie in here how trees grow into that and different sorts of tree biology, and then kind of the ecosystem aspects of that too. And we touched on climate as well. And the global climate is a really fun one. PLT also has a whole collection of activities that are just on climate, and they use forests to describe it, which is really helpful, especially in Maine, because we all are surrounded by forests, and it can be a little bit more tangible for students to understand because they are surrounded by it and are familiar with them. And they're also working on new climate activities too. So we'll hopefully have more of that in the next year or so. So I also wanted to touch on, so if you have a print guide from one of our other professional development events, in the back, you'll have the resources in the appendices that will, it goes into the different subjects, and I mean, curricular subjects, and then it also goes into different aspects of the activities that cover different skills as well. So if you have certain standards that you need to meet, I would just wanted to point that out and remind you that it's there because it can be super helpful. And then each activity has one of these pages that's on the right here as well. So if that's something that you find yourself needing, I can help you find those if you can't seem to find them, but it goes into the specifics of the standards that are being met in each activity and how you can pull those as well. So before we jump into questions, I just wanted to share with you the other opportunities for professional development. So if you're an educator that is looking for the credit hours from today, we're going to get that out to you at the end of this. So we're doing once a month for the fall season, so October, November, December, and we'll get those credit hours out to you at the end. So right after our December session, so that we can do all 3 of those at once. But we also have other professional development. Our Forest Trees of Maine happen every summer, and we go to 2 different areas of the Maine forest sector and look at different aspects of that. We go to land trusts, we go to mills, we explore a bunch of different areas and different aspects of the forest product sector, like maple syrup, a whole bunch of different aspects of it, and really dive into the ways that we can incorporate that and teach a whole bunch of different life skills and subjects with that material. And then the other opportunity that we have outside of this webinar series is customized professional development for districts and then local regions too. I'm more than happy to work with your district if that's something you think that you and your colleagues would benefit from. So I'm gonna check the chat here really quick. Do you all have any questions? If you want to drop it in the chat, we can answer them that way. Or you're more than welcome to unmute and talk that way too. If you have implementation questions, if you have barriers that you've found that you want to try to overcome with students or in the classroom or outside the classroom, we have a bunch of time and we would more than happy to help you navigate those.
A question for Lindsay. Lindsay, with those, would you call them forest journals or whatever it's called, or nature journals? So the questions that the students were writing in there, like every question, I was like, I can tie this right to something that I want to teach about how trees work. Can you talk a little bit about what the goal is of those journals, and do you try to form those formal linkages to other kind of learning outcomes about kind of answering those basically, or is it kind of a separate goal that you're trying to achieve there?
So double-edged sword, yes and no. So when I set my students up with a nature journal, depending on where we are in the curriculum, I might tie it in, I might not. Those questions, I give them an FYI. The tree doesn't talk back, so the tree won't tell them how old they were, or the tree won't tell them like the snow is cold and I feel it and it hurts, right? They're not going to answer those kinds of questions, but there are questions in there that I could bring back and we could answer. But for the sake of nature journaling, I just want my students to ask questions, be curious, and not necessarily be like, oh, I can go Google that and I can find that answer out. Whereas if you were to adopt this and bring nature journaling into your setting, you might want to dive in a little bit deeper. So nature journaling to me, if I were to flip through my journal pages, and I see a couple of you guys on here that I've seen over the summer, some people might say, oh, it's beautiful art, but sometimes if you look at a page, it's very scientific. And I do like if something, so I had my appendix removed first day of school this year. That was fun. And I literally was like, what is this thing? And if I give me like a half a second. So I was really curious about it. And I wanted to know more about it because Darwin thought, it's this little shriveled up thing. It's pointless. And I went in and I did like hardcore research about it. And I really like truly, so in 1522, described the structure. In 1735 was the first appendectomy. And so like I went in and does it have a real function? Theory, yes. One, it does do this. In theory, two, it might do this. So sometimes it might be, I go back, like the fall foliage right now. So the fall foliage and colors I'm going to do with my students this week. And right now I'm noticing none of the oaks are changing. None. And I'm like, what's wrong with the oaks? Are you okay? Right. And so I want to see if my students pick up on that now that we can identify the trees, you know, if they're noticing anything like that. So, yes, thank you. John Muir Law's book on how to teach nature journaling. It's amazing. John Muir Laws is who I journaled or who I learned from, not related to the dead John Muir, but probably named after him, something like that. But yeah, so to answer your question, yes and no. Sometimes we do revisit them, but it's more to spark their curiosity in nature again.
Cool, thank you.
Do we have other questions? I'll also be sending the recording and resources out. And I know Lindsay has some nature journaling resources, so I can send that out with those as well.
Since Lindsay kind of prompted the question, I have to ask Jay if he has a good answer to why oaks change late compared to other species such as maple, beech, and birch.
I don't have a good answer for that for this year. There's a whole thing we talk about with fall color and fall phenology, but we find that it's for plants mostly driven by photoperiod around here. So the length of days is primarily what drives it, and then it's also influenced by environmental conditions like the temperature and stuff like that, and the brightness of the coloring. But most of actually the interesting stuff with the timing of leaves is happening in the springtime in terms of like climate change responses and stuff. So we're seeing kind of advances in the leaf out dates for some species. They're able to respond to warmer springs, but we don't see major changes with fall temperatures. So that's kind of like a nice dodge, Logan. I've learned that over the years. Dodge your detailed question about oak and then broaden it to something I do know about. But no, I'm not sure. I was just kind of thinking about that, and I was looking at that as well. Yeah, I'll have to see. But in the end, it's a relatively minor impact on kind of the overall function and health of the tree, I think, because we're at the end of the season. They're not doing a lot of photosynthesis. It's just kind of, are they able to resorb a lot of the nutrients from the leaves before they drop them is probably the big question. So there may be something going on there.
Well, one question I have for the participants, is there any specific questions you had about forest biology and ecology that you were hoping to answer today that wasn't answered? Great, so we did a good job.
Well, that being said, we are more than welcome to answer any questions that you have. If you think of them, or if you try to implement something and it could have gone better, or if you have something super awesome that you want to share, we always love those too. So these are all the contacts that we've shared with you. Like I said, the resources will go out to you, and I'll make sure that those emails are in there as well, so you'll have those. We're going to have another series or session of this series in November, and we're going to be talking about forest management and a bunch of different ways to incorporate that into the classroom. So if that's of interest, I'll be sending the information out for that the week prior. But otherwise, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. And I'll stick on for a few minutes here if you guys have questions that you think of. But otherwise, I mean, here's 10 more minutes of your afternoon. And feel free to let us know if you have questions.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to hang up too for a little bit if anybody actually has questions too.